Hello, and welcome to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary's Stay-at-Home Speaker Series. Today's program is Raptor ID for Beginners with David Barber, Hawk Mountain's Senior Research Biologist.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks so much for joining us, David. My name is Jamie Dawson. I'm the Director of Education at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, and we are so glad that you are joining us today. Hawk Mountain is the world's very first refuge for birds of prey, and we continue to work hard to be leaders in raptor conservation, science, and education, locally and globally around the world. Hawk Mountain is a private nonprofit, and membership is the lifeblood of our organization. To all of our members, thank you so much for your continued support. And if you're joining us today and you're not a member, we hope that you consider becoming one in the future. Hawk Mountain hopes that everyone remains safe and healthy during these times of COVID crisis, and we are thrilled to offer our community a variety of free virtual programming. As always, Hawk Mountain greatly appreciates any donations. Just so everyone is aware, today's program is being recorded. The video will then be accessible on Hawk Mountain's YouTube channel as a continued resource. We also have a link on our website directly connecting you to our YouTube channel. At any time during today's program, viewers may submit questions through the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform, and we've designated time at the end of the program to take some questions from the audience. And we are so excited that David Barber is joining us today to share with us some of his raptor identification expertise. And before we get started, I'd love to share some of David's background experience with our audience. David has worked at Hawk Mountain for over 20 years, starting as a naturalist and now serving as the sanctuary's senior research biologist. He oversees biological monitoring on the sanctuary, including breeding bird censuses and long-term raptor counts. He also manages the sanctuary's geographic information system and satellite telemetry database. When he's not scanning the skies for migrants at North Lookout, David can be found working in his garden, walking his golden retriever, or perhaps brewing beer at a small brew pub in Catasauqua, PA. So David, it sounds like you have some really fun hobbies and extracurricular activities.
I do, yeah. Some of them obsessions, but yes.
So how did you get involved in the field of avian or bird science?
It all started when I was in college at Rutgers University. I took an ornithology class and was completely enamored with birds. It was the first class I took where I could take what I learned inside the classroom and go outside and just apply it. And I just had no idea there were so many birds.
Awesome, thank you so much. And so as part of your job at Hawk Mountain, you get to travel around the world studying birds. What are some of the more interesting places that you have gone to do some field research projects?
Well, I was lucky enough after college, before I came to Hawk Mountain, to do a lot of field work in different jobs around the world, Australia, Ecuador. But since I came to Hawk Mountain, probably the most exciting place I've been is the Falkland Islands, where the birds are completely different. And you know, who doesn't love penguins? And there are 5 species of penguins we can see there. So it was wonderful.
I am so ready to travel to the Falklands. I want to check it out. So David, you've been working at Hawk Mountain for over 2 decades. Can you share with us one of your most memorable experiences from working at the sanctuary?
Sure. I mean, I have a ton of memorable experiences, not only witnessing the migration, but also just the wonderful volunteers and visitors we have at the lookout. But probably my most memorable moment was we're often looking out the ridge, trying to scan for birds. And I had a person with me and he said, "Oh, there's a bird coming in over 2." And so you immediately look at 2 and you're looking in the distance for birds. And I'm telling him, "I can't see this bird. I don't see it." And he's like, "It's right there. It's right over 2." I'm like, "I can't see it." And then so finally I took my binoculars down, and there 50 feet in front of the lookout is this juvenile peregrine falcon coming in just about 20 feet above us, and then took a swipe at the owl and then kept going. I mean, it was just extraordinary. I mean, I still get goosebumps just thinking about that story right now.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. So David, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think we have a lot of people out there that are ready to improve on their Raptor ID skills. So show us the way.
All right, will do. Okay, so thank you everybody for signing up for the webinar. I hope you have a good time with this. Just to start off, I'm predominantly going to talk about Raptor ID in flight and predominantly birds here in the East, just simply because we're limited by a little bit of time. So if you think about North American raptors, we can group them into several groups. And within these groups, individuals or different species all have similarities, so they can be grouped together. Granted, some of these raptor groups only have one species, like harrier and osprey, but we could also actually group these a little bit more. I'm going to actually talk about vultures, eagles, and osprey as one group, as the big, large migrating birds. And I do want to point out, I'm not going to talk anything about kites today, since we rarely see them here in the East.
David, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure.
I just got a comment from the audience that some people are having a hard time hearing you. Could you maybe talk a little louder or move the microphone closer to your mouth?
Sure, will do.
Thank you so much.
Yep, you bet. So there are lots of different tools that we use for migration, lots of great field guides that are out there. If you're just looking for a photographic guide, Raptors of Eastern and Western North America is a great one by Brian Wheeler. And that gives you an idea of what the birds are looking like. If you want to really dive deep into what the birds will look like during migration, as in flight, a classic is Pete Dunn's Hawks in Flight. It's not really doesn't have a lot, there's no color pictures, but it really dives deep into differentiating different species and how they move into migration. The other great book that just came out several years ago is Jerry Ligori's Hawks at a Distance and Hawk from Every Angle, because you're not always seeing these birds coming in, flying straight overhead. Sometimes you see them from the side, wing on, head on, below and above you. So these are some really great tools that you can use to just get started with raptor identification. There's also a great app that's being used by Hawkwatch International. It's available on Google Play and the App Store. The great thing about this is it not only has photos, but videos as well, and tips and that help you in identification, as well as birds in flight. So when we're talking about hawk identification, really what we want to do is be able to, when we see a bird, narrow it down into one of those groups that I mentioned earlier. And the way we're doing that is, you can think about it, sure, we can use what does the bird look like, as in the coloration of the bird. But a lot of times the conditions that you're witnessing the bird doesn't really lend itself to using those field marks. So a lot of times what we're using is the shape and the body proportions. So for example, this bird that I have on the screen, if we look at it, we can say this bird has relatively broad wings, a little bit long tail, but also broad as well. And that kind of narrows it down into the groups of the bootios, which we'll cover later. We obviously can't tell anything from flight behavior, but likely this bird is soaring. Bootios tend to be those soaring birds. And sometimes we can use size. Often it's a little bit tricky though, unless you have something that you can, another bird that you can say, okay, this is a smaller than, say, an eagle or something like that. So it's all relative. And a lot of people say, well, there's a big bird out there. And as it gets closer, we see that it's really not that big at all. And finally, we can look at field marks, the coloration of the bird. And finally, one thing to always keep in mind is the breeding range. If you're trying to search through a field guide, you really don't want to look at species that aren't in your area, maybe Western birds. And there's certainly a chance that it may be one of those, but chances are that it's not going to be one of those birds. So diving right in, people are probably aware of the vultures that we see in the United States. We have two species. These are big, dark birds with small, unfeathered heads. They eat carrion, and they, if you had feathers and you're sticking your head into a dead deer, you really wouldn't want to mess up your feathers. So that's why they have bald heads. Turkey vultures are probably the most common vulture that we see here in the Northeast. It's a huge bird with a 6-foot wingspan, has a long tail. Adults have red heads, whereas juveniles have gray heads. And as I mentioned, it's a dark bird. The wing lining underneath is kind of a silvery gray. And really the diagnostic flight pattern of these birds is they hold their wings up in a shallow V or a dihedral, and they rock a lot. As they move with the wind currents, they really are masters of manipulating those wing currents. So even at a great distance, you can see that these birds have kind of light wing linings, but also they tend to move in or fly with the dihedral as well. So even when they're soaring, I'm going to talk a little bit about these birds in relation to soaring versus gliding. Soaring is when birds are using thermals to ride up and gain altitude, and gliding is when they are coming out of those thermals or just gradually losing altitude, but not flapping very much, and they're not gaining altitude by using soaring. So even in a soar, these birds have a fairly significant dihedral. And you can see in the lower left, this is a bird that is approaching kind of head on, and they still do have a slight dihedral as well. So even at a fairly long distance, looking at a turkey vulture, you can see, well, it's a dark bird and it's rocking a lot. And there's really no other species that's going to show those types of behaviors. In contrast, the black vulture is a little bit smaller, still a very large raptor. The adults have all gray heads as well as the juveniles, but the size and the shape is very different. It's a little bit smaller than a turkey vulture, whereas the turkey vulture had those long wings. The black vulture has shorter wings. It has white patches at the end of the wings, which is really obvious when they're flying. And the tail isn't nearly as long. It almost looks like somebody took a pair of scissors on a turkey vulture tail and cut it off. It's really short, very broad. And these birds do not fly on dihedrals. They fly on very flat wings, and they tend to flap a lot more. Turkey vultures almost never flap, and when they do, it's very kind of labored. They don't like to flap very much, whereas black vultures often flap several times on very stiff wings, and then interspersed with a glide. But still, as far as vultures goes, they still don't fly or don't flap very much at all.
David, I'm sorry, can I just interrupt you again?
Sure.
I'm so sorry, but a few people are saying that it's very hard to hear you. I don't know if there's anything we can get closer.
I can hold my microphone up like this, maybe.
Okay, that might help some people.
Okay.
Oh, people from the audience are saying perfect.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
So moving on to some larger big birds. I think everybody is probably familiar with the bald eagles. Their adults are easy to identify with a bright white head and a bright white tail. However, when it comes to immatures, they don't look like adults. They're more mottled brown and white. And so it's very difficult. They're not as easy to identify, but we can still use the shape and the size of bald eagles to identify it as a bald eagle. So bald eagles are huge birds with a 7.5-foot wingspan. They have very long, straight wings. So we often tell people that at North Lookout, when you see a soaring eagle or bald eagle, it tends to look like a flying plank. So very straight, flat wings, a very, very broad tail. And if you look at the picture up in the right, you can see how big this head is. I mean, and not only that, but take a look at the bill on this bird. It's about almost a third the size of the head. So these are birds with very big heads, very flat wings, steady soaring flight. Even in high winds, they tend to fly very steadily. And with large birds, they tend to, as they're rising up at a thermal, they have very they form very large circles as birds get smaller. When we talk about, say, a sharp-shinned later on, they soar in very small circles as they're gaining altitude. So the vultures are the bald eagles flying large circles, flat wings, and a very big bird. So when we look at juveniles or immatures in general, the bald eagle takes about 5 years to go from juvenile plumage to adult plumage, and that bright white head and tail. And I'm not going to get into, you are able to distinguish a first-year bird from a third-year bird from a fourth-year bird, but that's a little more involved than we want to get. But it's safe to say that immature bald eagles have varying amounts of white on the body somewhere until they reach that 5-year-old stage. And when we look at the head on these birds, it sticks out far from the body, almost as much as the tail sticks out from the body. So it's kind of symmetrical. And the reason why I'm telling you this is in comparison, golden eagles have very small heads, which I'll show you in a minute. Golden eagles are large, dark raptors as well, almost the size of a bald eagle, maybe slightly smaller, but they're brown overall, and they have this really beautiful golden nape back of their head. The adults are pretty much chocolate brown, as it was in that earlier slide, all brown underneath, and the immature birds have varying amounts of white at the base of the tail and some white in the wings as well. They are, again, a large bird, barely steady flight, circling as they soar up, very large circles. But what's different about golden eagles is that they fly with the dihedral as well, just like turkey vultures, only not nearly as pronounced. And if you remember the size of the head on that bald eagle, how it sticks almost out as far as the tail, golden eagles have a very small head. So even at a distance, you can usually say, it's a barely large bird, it must be an eagle, but you can hardly see any head, and it has a slight dihedral, chances are it's a golden eagle. One thing to point out, this is an immature down here again with the white patches in the wings and the white tails, and 2 adults in the upper pictures. Golden hackles often, if the sunlight is shining on them, can often look like it might be a bald eagle. It has a light colored head. But as the bird gets closer, usually you can see either it's a very small head, or maybe it's flying with the dihedral. So it is a golden eagle. Osprey is the 5th bird in this group of large raptors. It's a little bit different. It has a 6-foot wingspan, so it is a big bird, but it's a fairly slim, slender bird. It has that dark back and a white head, just like a bald eagle, but it's bright white underneath. And this bird is shaped more like a gull. It has long, slender wings, slender body, and it flies a lot like a gull as well. So it has as I mentioned, long wings. And so often when it's soaring or when it's gliding, like in this lower picture in the left, it tends to droop its wings. So if you have the bird coming at you, it almost kind of looks like the wings are bowed a little bit. But probably the diagnostic flight pattern of ospreys is this M-shaped profile. So as they're gliding, they tend to thrust their wrists forward. And this just gives this M-shaped profile, which is, as I mentioned, is diagnostic. There really is no other species in the US that's going to look quite like that. So we covered 5 big birds, and as you can see in these pictures, they're all slightly different. There's always something that distinguishes them from the other species. Turkey vultures are rocking a lot. Another bird with a dihedral. Golden eagles have a slight dihedral but a really small head. Bald eagles have this huge head, big wide flights, plank-like wings that flying on flat wings. Same as a black vulture, and I'm not ashamed to admit that often when birds, a black vulture is really far away, you get, your pulse starts racing because you think it's a bald eagle, but as it gets closer, no, it's a black vulture. So, but the other thing is that while an osprey may look like a bald eagle with that dark back and white head, it's usually those slim, slender wings. And when it banks, you get that bright white belly. And that's usually a good indication that it's an osprey. So there's always something that will distinguish other species from other species. And when I talked about the size and the shape and the flight patterns of some of these birds, when we identify a bird, especially at the Hawkwatch site, we're really not relying on just one identification mark. We're not, if it's a bald eagle, an adult bald eagle, sure, bright white head and a bright white tail, that's pretty obvious. But a lot of times we're using several different characteristics of flight or size that allow us to identify what the bird is. Northern harrier is one of those species that we can actually identify not only by sex, but by age as well. So on the left is a female harrier, brown with some brown streaking on the breast. All the way on the right is a male. Some call it a gray ghost. It is grayish blue on the back, has some black wingtips. And in the middle here is a juvenile, brown on the back, and I wish you could see it, but kind of an orange belly to it. But one of the things that they all have is, if you notice, this little facial disc, kind of like what an owl has. And it's really a method or something that was evolved for hunting. They tend to hunt a lot by sound, just like owls do. So Northern harriers have long, slender wings and a long tail. Some like wings sort of like an osprey, but a much longer tail. Here's again, the male here up on the right with those black wingtips. They will fly with the dihedral, both when they're hunting low to the ground as well as when they're soaring. But really the diagnostic field mark for a northern harrier is this white rump patch that you see at the base of the tail. If you see that, then it's pretty much guaranteed that you're seeing a northern harrier. And I'll touch briefly on that when I talk a little bit about red-tailed hawks. But because these birds have long, slender wings, when they're flapping, they kind of have this buoyant, methodic flight that really distinguishes them from some of the other species that have more stiffer wing beats. Accipiters is a group of species that have short rounded wings, long tails. These birds have evolved in forests where being able to dive in between branches and between trees is advantageous when they hunt birds. They typically have short bursts of flapping interspersed with gliding. So you can think of that as a flap, 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 glide, flap, 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 glide. The smallest accipiter is a sharp-shinned hawk. It's about the size of a blue jay. The adults here in the left are kind of a slate gray on the back and have some rufous or rusty barring on the front. And this bird on the right is a juvenile. It is brown on the back, has some brown streaking on the front, have a relatively small head, and we'll compare that to a bird later on that has a bigger head. But you can see with this tail, as it's folded together, it's fairly squared off at the edges. So as I mentioned before, the sharp-shinned hawks have fairly stiff wing beats. They tend to kind of thrust their wings forward a little bit, like we see in this upper picture. Have a very erratic flight in that they're a fairly small bird. They get blown around a lot. So they tend to move up and down a lot and intersperse that flapping with the gliding. So it's not a very direct flight, but a fairly erratic. And they have a fairly small head, so it doesn't stick very far out from the body. And we tend to think of sharp-shinned hawks as a flying mallet. At a very long distance, you can barely see the head projection. So one of the things that we look at is if we draw a line kind of from the wrists of the bird across, head barely sticks out from that line that we draw. So a very small head projection. And we can see that a little bit better on some of these pictures. If we draw a line, the head barely sticks out from the bend in the wings. And you can see how they really thrust those wings forward. So their head is tucked. And these are birds going by North Lookout. And you can still see that nice squared off tail. And these are all, well, this top one is an immature. You can see the streaking on it. This looks like an adult, and again, not very much head projection. So again, a flying mallet is how we describe those birds. In contrast, the Cooper's hawk, if the coloration of the plumage is almost identical to sharp-shinned hawk, they have that gray rusty back, or gray, blue-gray back, rusty barring on the front, but they're a little bit bigger. And they have a more rounded tail, which is be more prominent in a second, and they have a bigger head, which is kind of squared off, so you can see. On this bird on the upper right, kind of a squared off head, not nearly as small as the sharp-shinned hawk. So with this large head and a large tail, longer tail, kind of in proportion to the body, you can see the rounded tail in flight. These are birds that are, the reason why this tail is rounded is because the outer tail feathers are shorter than the inner tail feathers. So when it's held together like that, it forms a nice rounded edge. So if we the same thing and draw a line in between the bend in the wings in the Cooper's hawk, we see that the head projects much further out from the body than in the sharp-shinned hawk. So we would call Cooper's hawk a flying cross rather than a flying mallet. It tends to soar in larger circles than sharp-shinned hawk simply because it is a larger bird. It soars also with a slight dihedral, whereas sharp-shins soar with a very flat wings. And it tends to, because it is a bigger bird, the flaps are usually a little bit deeper and a little bit stiffer as well. So these are all immature Cooper's hawks. And so if we look back at the differences between the two species, and this is really the most difficult identification in hawk watching in the East. Sometimes we just can't tell whether it actually is a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk. They have characteristics of both, and that's what the category of unidentified accipiter is for. You know, and if a hawk watcher tells you I can ID an accipiter 100% of the time, they're lying. So on the left, we have the sharp-shinned hawk with head tucked and barely projecting very far out from the wings, whereas the Cooper's hawk on the right, a big head. The Cooper's hawk has that rounded tail. Sharp-shins have that squared off tail. And this is just a headshot of a sharp-shin and a Cooper's. And sharp-shins have that small head and often looks like the eye is almost too big for the head. Whereas in the Cooper's hawk, it's big, eye looks more proportional, and it has a squared off head. Northern goshawks are our largest accipiter. It's a big bird, large, heavy body. The adults are unmistakable. They are blue-gray on the back and have gray barring on the front. Immatures are brown and streaky, just like the other accipiters. But one characteristic they both have is this bright white eyebrow or supercilium. They also tend to have, the barring also tends to be wavy on the back, or on the tail, but it's often not something you can see when the bird is in flight. So again, these are bigger birds, out. They have a very deep body. So when they're flying in kind of head on, it looks barrel chested. They have very deep wing beats. They fly on flat wings as opposed to the Cooper's hawks, and the wings are much longer than a Cooper's. And in contrast to the other accipiters, sharpshins have that squared off tail. The Coopers have a rounded tail. The tail in a goshawk is more of a wedge shape. And when the bird is coming in, since it has longer wings, when you're looking at the bird head on, it often droops its wings a little bit. So you can see those wing tips kind of dipping down further than the top of the wing. And we also say that it has small hands. And what I mean by small hands, if you look at this upper left, you can see these are the primaries, and they tend to be a lot more narrow when you look at the end of the wing. Whereas a sharp-shinned Cooper's hawk, there would be more of a bulge out here. So what we call is small hands. Again, just a little something that may help you distinguish among the three birds. And also the immature goshawks tend to have a very heavy barring as opposed to a Cooper's hawk. So getting on to another group, bootios. These are birds that have evolved to take advantage of thermals. They're soaring birds. They rarely flap, and they have fairly long, or broad wings, both broad from front to back, and they also have a fairly broad tail as well. And there are 4 species of bootios that we can see here in the east, but I'm not going to cover rough-legged hawks simply because we don't see them very often, and I don't have enough time. So, broad-winged hawks are our smallest boodio. It's about the size of a crow. An adult up here on the left has kind of chocolate barring on the front, on the chest. Immatures over here on the right just have brown streaking that usually extends down the side of the bird. These are what our former Director of Conservation Science, Keith Bilstein, called super flocking migrants. They form large flocks during migration. They could be in the hundreds here at Hawk Mountain, but as the bird migrates further south into Central America, these flocks can number in the thousands. And they're really, as I mentioned, a bird that's built for soaring, take advantage of those thermals. They have broad wings. Adults have this fairly broad black and white tail banding on the upper right photo. They also have a very distinctive dark trailing edge on the bird as well. And they have a fairly pointed wing as far as bootios go. You can think of a red-tailed hawk, which I'll show you later. They're more kind of rounded at the end, whereas broad-winged hawks are a little bit more pointed. Here is the juvenile on the bottom with this brown streaking on the breast. But one of the characteristics of immature broad-winged hawks is that they have this light colored panel in the wing. You can really only see it when the bird is backlit. But one of the things that will distinguish immature bootios, or among them, is that light colored panel that you see in the wing. Typically, the underwing is fairly light. There's really no distinctive markings in the wings here and here. But when they fold their tail, it tends to make a little bit longer. And so when you're looking at a bird coming head on, the tail looks a little bit longer than most bootios. And also they tend to have a very stout body, very compact. And as the bird glides, we often see that they kind of thrust their wrists forward a little bit, and trailing edge, this edge here as it flies by, is relatively flat. Whereas in other bootios, you tend to see a larger bulge. Red-tailed hawks, this is probably the most the one hawk that most people are familiar with. If you drive down the road and you see a hawk sitting on the side of the road, it's almost guaranteed to be a red-tailed hawk. The adults, with the namesake, have this red tail, whereas the juveniles do not. They're fairly light underneath. This is a juvenile here on the right. They both have kind of a white belly and white upper chest, but they also have this brown streaking, which forms what we call a belly band. So even at a long distance, if you're looking at a bird that's perched, usually that white with the belly band is fairly obvious, although there is quite a bit of variation as well. So these red-tailed hawks, some of the other diagnostic characteristics of both adults and juveniles or immatures is this area in the upper left with the arrow. It's called the patagium. So it has this dark patagium. No other raptor in the East has that. They also have these little comma-shaped carpal patches up here on the upper right. They're really the only species that has that as well. But you can tell in both, this is the juvenile up here in the upper right and an adult on the left. You can see the belly band really well in this juvenile or immature, and this one is a little bit lighter, but they both have that dark or a belly band typically. These are large bootios, so they fly in slow, steady circles. They have fairly flat wings, although sometimes just the wing tips can turn up at the end. Whereas I mentioned on the broad-winged hawk where it has that fairly flat trailing edge, usually on a red-tailed hawk it's an S shape. So while this is not a bird that's gliding, you will see this a bird that's gliding as well. It's kind of shaped like an S on this back trailing edge. And like all bootios, it has a fairly wide tail. So jumping to red-shouldered hawks, this is kind of a bird that's intermediate in size between red-tailed hawks and broad-winged hawks. Adult here in the center has this really nice rusty barring on the chest and this little bit of red or rusty on the shoulder, hence a red-shouldered hawk. And it has, while the broad-winged hawk had wide black and white bands, in the red-shouldered hawk, it's big black bands interspersed with fairly narrow white bands, like on this bird all the way on the left. And this will be more apparent in a bird that's soaring. And the juvenile on the lower right here is a brownish black with some brown streaking on the front. So fairly similar to some of the other immature bootios. But one of the diagnostic characteristics of both immature and adult red-shouldered hawks is this light crescent that we see in the wings. So it's just a light area that when the bird is backlit, the sun shines through and is very apparent even at a fairly long distance. These birds are, again, they're bootios, so they spend a lot of time soaring. They tend to kind of thrust their wings forward. So if we look at this bird in the upper right, you can see how its wrists are kind of reaching forward. It has a fairly long tail for a buteo, and it often tends to flap a lot more than some of the other buteos. So it will have that characteristic accipiter flight of a flap, flap, flap glide. And with that longer tail, it's why we call it's more of an accipiter-like buteo than any of the other buteos. And I think it was Pete Dunn who said, if you have an accipiter coming in and it morphs into a buteo, then it's probably a red-shouldered hawk. Moving on to the falcons, a lot different shape. These birds have fairly long pointed wings and long narrow tails, and they're really built for flying. These are birds that use powered flight a lot more than any of the other species, and they're also fairly fast. The kestrel is our smallest falcon. This is a male on the lower right. It has this bluish wings, and a rusty tail that ends with a dark black band. And in the upper right is a female. Its tail is kind of rusty and brown striping, but otherwise kind of rufusy on the back. And both birds are light underneath, and both have kind of this bull mustache stripe here on the top of the head. These are birds that are small. They're about the size of a sharpshin or the size of a blue jay. So just like the sharp-shinned hawk, any kind of heavy wind, it tends to have a quick, fluttery flight, moves up and down a lot, and will have that same sort of flight with a flap, flap, flap glide, gliding interspersed with flapping or vice versa. Merlins are nearly the same size as a kestrel, a little bit bigger. Males have this nice blue-gray back with a striped tail. Females or immatures, we can't really distinguish between the two, are brownish on the back and have these brown streaking. Both appear very dark. So kestrels, when they're flying, you tend to see erratic flight and a light belly. Almost always merlins just appear very dark. They have powerful kind of pumping wing beats, so they are incredibly fast. Usually at North Lookout, we call out merlin, and just about the time everybody gets their binoculars up, the bird is gone. They're fairly aggressive and will often harass other raptors as they're migrating through. But they do have the typical long pointed wings of a falcon. The wings tend to be wider than a kestrel's. And again, powerful flight, very direct and very fast. The peregrine falcon is our largest falcon that we typically see here. There are larger falcons that we don't see very often, the gyr falcon. But these are, again, large, bigger than a merlin, powerful, very stout, long, pointy wings, much longer in kind of comparison to a merlin as far as proportions go. Both adults and juveniles have this dark facial patch. This is an adult on the left. It has kind of a bluish, dark gray back and this dark gray barring across the chest. And immatures have kind of a smaller cheek patch and just some dark barring or streaking on the breast. Again, long wings, long tail, very fast moving bird. Because they are a larger falcon, they tend to fly in broader circles as they're soaring. All these birds will soar in flight typically, but the falcons are really built for powered flight. Fairly fast. They soar on relatively flat wings. And like some of the other big birds, even in windy conditions, they are fairly steady. So they don't, their flight is not very erratic like some of the smaller birds. So thinking back to, you see a raptor in flight, one of the things, we don't necessarily want to rely on any one factor. We want to look at what is the shape of the body. Does it have broad wings, pointed wings? How long is the tail? How long is the tail in proportion to the body? What is the relative size, if we can tell that? And if we're lucky enough and the lighting is right, what are the field marks that we can use to try and narrow it down to one of those groups? I know this is when you're trying to get into hawk watching, it's a little overwhelming. There's a lot of information out there. So the first step is really identifying it down to that group. And then you can get into the nitty gritty of what are the individual field marks and what are the flight characteristics of the different species. So, and again, the breeding range. And one of the other things we could also look at is seasonal timing. So if you see a golden eagle in the east, or you think you see a golden eagle in the east and it's summertime, it's probably not a golden eagle because they only migrate through in the fall. So again, I want to encourage you, don't be discouraged. There's a lot of information there, but you can always go back and re-look at this webinar on our YouTube channel. And And again, probably one of the best ways to learn hawks is to go out to a hawk watch site and sit with the counters or the other hawk watchers and ask them why they think it's this species or that species. So, and that's really the best way to learn, that and repetition. So thank you very much for putting up with me for 40 minutes, and I hope you enjoy your day.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. You are a wealth of information, and I wish I could just absorb your Raptor ID knowledge, but certainly your presentation helped me learn a lot, and I'm sure the audience as well. We have several questions from the audience, so
Sure.
let me pull them up. Okay, so in the beginning, David, you shared the story of the falcon swiping at the owl as it went past the lookout. And this person asking the question has seen the owl at North Lookout at Hawk Mountain, but would like to know what does the owl represent to the migrating birds? Why have that owl on the mountaintop?
So a great horned owl is a nest predator of most of these species of raptors. So, and they're also considered competitors as well. And obviously owls are nocturnal, raptors are diurnal, so they don't really interact very much. So when a raptor sees an owl out in the middle of the day exposed like that, it'll often try and chase it away. So even though these birds are on migration, this isn't their territory. It is so instinctual that that shape, the birds will often dive on it to try and chase the gray horned owl away. And believe it or not, feathers do make a big difference. So I guess that little fluttering helps the raptor think that it's actual real live owl. So.
Thank you so much for explaining that. So the next question, earlier, David, when you were talking about dihedrals for the turkey vulture, and also you mentioned that the golden eagle can have a slight dihedral. Can you explain exactly what a dihedral is for those in the audience who might not know?
So a dihedral is just when the bird holds their wings up kind of in a shallow U or a shallow V. And it's just a way of gathering the kind of the wind currents and kind of stabilizing the body. So it's just a way that the birds can take advantage of different wind currents. So dihedral is just that shallow way the birds hold their wings, shallow V.
Thank you so much. Next question, is location of sighting a key, such as an osprey will be seen near the water, a northern harrier low over fields? Is that important in trying to make the identification as well?
It certainly can help. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff I was talking about was during migration, but yeah, certainly harriers tend to hunt low over fields, whereas a lot of other species don't, especially with that dihedral. And you know, being close to water, you tend to see ospreys more, but in migration, kind of all bets are off. You know, we see lots of ospreys during migration, but there really is no large water bodies near us. So they really are just following that ridge. But yeah, habitat certainly can be an influence of kind of narrowing down what species you might see in that area.
Thank you. And now, David, a somewhat personal question. What is your favorite raptor?
Well, that's like asking, you know, what's my favorite dog? And I do have a favorite, but I won't say. I would probably say a northern goshawk, just because I think I have some of my most memorable moments at North Lookout have been with northern goshawks. And they're just big, beautiful, powerful birds, and the adults with the gray barring and gray back are just spectacular. So,
Thank you. What is the weight range of the eagle, osprey, vulture group?
the weight range, that's a great question. I would say I don't know off the top of my head how much an osprey weighs. Turkey vultures are somewhere in around 4 pounds, and I believe bald eagles get up to around 8. That might be a little bit of a guess, but I would say somewhere around there. I would expect ospreys to be a little bit less than a turkey vulture, so maybe 3 pounds.
I'll take that answer. That sounds good to me. Question about woodpeckers. Have there been many pileated woodpeckers nesting at Hawk Mountain this year?
We certainly hear a lot of pileated woodpeckers. We don't see them nearly as often, but yeah, we do hear them drumming as well as calling. So I would expect, sure, yeah, there's probably quite a few pileated woodpeckers on the lookout. And we can often hear more than two. So we know that there's probably several pairs at least on Hawk Mountain.
Thank you. Next question. How does someone become a hawk counter?
Well, you have to have a passion for it. If you're interested, just contact myself and at Barber at hawkmountain.org. And what we do is we put you with, you have to train for a year or two. So we know that you can identify the birds by sight and know that, be able to tell the difference between different species as well as the different ages of particular species or different sexes. So it's really just spending a lot of time at North Lookout or any other watch site and learning the differences in the birds. And then from that, you become an assistant counter. And then once you are ready, then you become a full-fledged counter as well. And I do want to mention that not only do we count the hawks that fly by, we count everything that flies by. So it's not required, but it's also very helpful if you can identify your songbirds, your dragonflies, and your butterflies as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have a question from Pace, and Pace wrote in, I'm 8 years old and would like to know, what is the smallest hawk?
The smallest hawk in, I will say, I'm going to go with the United States, and I believe that would be the kestrel. There are smaller hawks in Central and South America, and I'm drawing a blank on what it is off the top of my head. So.
All right, we have a question, and I know you mentioned, David, goshawks have a special place in your heart. Mm-hmm. What is the prognosis on goshawks?
That is a sticky conversation. We certainly know that based on the breeding bird atlases from Pennsylvania, that goshawks in Pennsylvania and the Northeast are in decline. It's interesting that the northern goshawk is an eruptive migrant, so it's often and they're a more northerly species. So when food supplies are low in the wintertime, usually we see an invasion, birds moving south to try and find food. That isn't happening nearly as often. And we know that, as I mentioned before, the species are in decline. Part of it is probably due to habitat loss, but there are probably other factors as well. We know that fishers will sometimes take young nestling goshawks. So yeah, the prognosis is not great, but we do have a project here at Hawk Mountain on, we're cooperating with other folks across the state trying to identify where goshawks are being seen and trying to look at the habitat that the birds are using. But I do know that last year, the Allegheny National Forest, which is really the stronghold for goshawks in the state, had no nesting goshawks last year. Mm-hmm. So hopefully things will improve this year.
We certainly hope so. And a follow-up question from another viewer about a goshawk and just about food selection. They commented that they actually saw a goshawk hunting a woodpecker, and they were curious, is this typical for goshawks to be hunting other birds?
Yes, actually that is kind of the characteristic of all accipiters. They are predominantly bird eaters, but they will feed on other small mammals as well.
Okay, thank you so much. We have so many great questions. Phenomenal. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. The one question I did want to briefly touch on, someone just wrote in, they're interested in putting up a kestrel nest box. Mm-hmm. Just talk very briefly about what would the preferred habitat be for that?
The preferred habitat would be farmland. kind of away from forested areas, and probably, I would say 15 feet up on usually a pole is what works best. But if you want more information, we certainly have information about that on our website, and look for kestrel nest box plans and sightings.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thanks for mentioning the information on our website. Thank you so much. The last question I just want to address, someone was asking, when is Hawk Mountain going to open? And when's the best time to come to Hawk Mountain? And David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say for hawk watching, fall migration is when you want to come to see the most, but it's always a wonderful time to visit Hawk Mountain.
Right, it's always a wonderful time. We certainly have a lot more migration in the fall, where we average about somewhere around 18,000 raptors of 16 different species. Our count runs from August 15th through December 15th, but really we have two peaks. Broadwing hawks will peak the third week in August, where you can see potentially thousands of birds move through in a day. But if you want to see the biggest variety, the middle of October is the best time. And if you can time it right, northwest winds is when you want to come. And that's when the birds really hug the ridge and come in close.
Thank you so much. And just to go back to the question as to when we are reopening, we are just making the best decisions we can day by day, week by week, based on guidance from our governor and, mandated recommendations. So unfortunately, we can't answer that question at that moment.
Right.
But that's all the time we have right now for questions. I do apologize. We weren't able to get to all of them, but please do keep in contact with Facebook or email us. Thank you, David Barber, for a phenomenal presentation. We got lots of comments in the chat and on the question and answers saying they really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you.
Good, I'm glad.
Yes, and thank you.
You're welcome.
Yay, thanks to our wonderful audience for joining us today. It means so much to us that you join us in these programs. So we hope to see you again soon. Some of the other virtual programs we have coming up in the next 2 weeks. Next Wednesday, May 20th, we have Trapping and Tracking with Bracken Brown at 1 p.m. On Friday, May 22nd, we have Chasing Broadwings from Pennsylvania to Peru with Dr. Goodrich at 4 p.m. On Wednesday, May 27th, we have Raptors Up Close, Owls Online with Ridgetop Rachel at 1 p.m. And on Thursday, May 28th, we have Sanctuary Storytime, A Nest is Noisy at 11 a.m. And lastly, on Friday, May 29th, we have Farmland Raptors at 4 p.m. Thanks again so much. We hope to see you again soon. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.